Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Garrett Allen for this one. Amy controls Crystal Vein that's enchanted with Wild Growth. If Amy sacrifices her Crystal Vein for 2, does this cause her to get an extra green from Wild Growth? Okay, so to answer this question, we'll first note that Wild Growth has a triggered mana ability. This sort of triggered ability follows all of the rules that normal triggered abilities follow, with the exception that it does not go on the stack. It just resolves immediately after the mana ability that causes it to trigger. In particular, this means that it triggers based on the game state and the objects that exist immediately after its trigger condition happens in the game. So what is Wild Growth's trigger condition? Well, this one is a little tricky. As you can see here, it actually is not the time when Crystal Vein is tapped. The CR defines that this ability triggers when Crystal Vein's ability resolves and adds colorless mana to Amy's mana pool. Now we have almost everything we need to answer the question from the original problem statement. Immediately after the Crystal Vein ability produces that mana, the game has to see if any triggered abilities need to trigger. Do they? Well, we do have this triggered ability from Wild Growth that says whenever enchanted permanent is tapped for mana, but there's just one problem. Wild Growth isn't attached to anything anymore. Crystal Vein has already been sacrificed by this point, so there is no enchanted permanent. Accordingly, the ability of Wild Growth will not trigger. But hold on a moment. There's triggered abilities that trigger when the affected permanent dies on all kinds of cards, and those work just fine. If the explanation that I gave is true, then how can stuff like Corpse Augur work at all? Okay, valid point, and if you were paying super close attention, then you might have noticed that when I had that rule up a second ago, it said that there were some exceptions. Don't worry, I was not trying to sneak anything by you. I was planning on talking about those, and now is a great time because it's relevant to the answer to that question. Some triggered abilities, like Corpse Augurs, look at the game state immediately before, not after, the trigger event to see if they should trigger. Specifically, Corpse Augur's triggered ability gets to do this because it's a leaves the battlefield ability. It triggers when Corpse Augur leaves the battlefield. Wild Growth does not have a leaves the battlefield ability. It triggers when you tap the permanent for mana. It just so happens that in this specific instance, that involved a permanent leaving the battlefield, but that's not ordinarily something that happens during this trigger's trigger event. Here's another one that I wanted to talk about because if someone looked up all the exceptions, I could see them thinking that it might apply. Triggered abilities that trigger specifically when something becomes unattached can look back in time. But again, this is not applicable for the same sort of reasoning. It just so happens that an object did become unattached during the event described in the original problem statement, but that's not something that Wild Growth specifically looks for. It's just a coincidence that it happened here. In case you're wondering, this exception is the reason why if your grafted war gear gets destroyed, then you still have to sacrifice the creature it was equipped to. That's the sort of thing that this exception is for. I think the rest of the exceptions are pretty obviously not applicable to this case, so I won't go through all of them here, but I encourage you to check out that claim by yourself by visiting that section of the CR if that's the sort of thing that you're into. Okay, there's one other loose end that I wanted to tie up. Sometimes the game uses the last known information about something that's happened in order to determine how to proceed. The rules specify exact circumstances under which this can apply, and like before, none of them are applicable to this case. Also, like before, I won't go through each and every one of them because several of them are obviously not related to what's going on here, but I did have a couple that I wanted to touch on. If you'd like to check my work, the whole list is in a video that I released a few years ago. First, there's this rule here that says that removal of an ability's source does not affect that ability once it's on the stack. There's even this part that says if the source of an ability needs to do something and some triggered ability references information about that source for use in putting that triggered ability onto the stack, then you can use the source's last known information to see what that information would be if the source has left the zone that it was supposed to be in. Now that certainly does look like it's going to be pretty related to what's going on here, but there are a couple of problems. Putting aside the fact that Wild Growth and Crystal Vein are mana abilities, which means that they do not use the stack at all, we also have the issue that says the Wild Growth's triggered ability is not having the source of some ability do something, which also means that this rule does not apply. This rule does mean, though, that if you were going to sacrifice a Fireblade artist to itself, then the game would know exactly what the characteristics of the Fireblade artist were. For example, that it's a red and black creature when putting the damage dealing part of that ability onto the stack, even though by that time the Fireblade artist has been put into your graveyard. Then there's this one that says if an effect requires information from the game about some object that's left the battlefield, then we can use its last known information. Well, we do need information from the game, but it's not an effect that's asking for it. An effect is something that happens as a result of a resolving spell or ability. What's happening in the original problem statement is that the game needs information about the game state in order to decide if a triggered ability is triggering. There isn't any resolving spell or ability that's asking what wild growth was attached to, and so that's why this rule will not help us. Phew, that was a lot of work for a relatively straightforward question, which is of course exactly why I like it so much. I hope that everyone else had a good time with this one too, but that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.